time. And without further ado, we should begin this session. We are very happy to have with us Mr. Daniel Trnka today. Mr. Trnka is an expert on regulatory affairs. As we all know, regulation plays an important role in an economy as it controls the behavior of the market by putting restrictions and defining the rules and regulations for the market players in order to protect the interests of the consumers. The regulators, while carrying on the tasks of formulation of regulatory policies and enforcement of regulation, must be very vigilant. The quality of regulation can have a good or bad impact on the economy, and unnecessary regulation, as we all know, can cause regulatory burden. Hence, it is essential for the regulators to identify and measure the usefulness and impact of regulation. Certain other factors, such as the costs involved and alternatives to the proposed regulation, should also be considered and evaluated prior to and post enforcement of the regulations. Today, Daniel Trnka, who has a vast experience in the field of regulation, will be speaking to us on the regulatory policy and quality of regulation in the OECD countries. And this session, of course, will provide us very useful insights on developing regulatory policies for ensuring the quality of regulations. A brief biography introduction of our esteemed speaker of the day, Mr. Trnka. Mr. Daniel Trnka works as a senior policy analyst in the regulatory policy division of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, that is the OECD, leading the regulatory management and delivery team. Mr. Daniel has been working in the area of public administration reform and regulatory reform for more than 20 years, both at the national and the international level. Before joining the OECD, he worked as Director of the Department of Regulatory Reform and Public Administration Quality of the Ministry of Interior of the Czech Republic. His main areas of expertise are administrative simplification, regulatory impact assessment, stakeholder engagement, and regulatory enforcement and inspections. He is the author or co-author of several OECD publications, including the recommendation of the OECD Council on Regulatory Policy and Governance, Cutting Red Tape, Why is Administrative Simplification So Complicated, OECD Best Practice Principles for Regulatory Enforcement and Inspections, OECD Best Practice Principles on Regulatory Impact Assessment, Administrative Simplification Reviews of Poland and Vietnam, and many, many others. With this short introduction, there's much more. We would like to welcome you, Mr. Trnka. We'd like to welcome on behalf of School of Competition Law and IICA all the participants, esteemed guests. Before I begin, I'd like, I can see some very esteemed guests with us, participants with us. If some of you would like to introduce yourselves, that would be great. We'll keep a minute for that initially now, so that we also can request you to switch on your videos and we can probably take a group picture for the benefit of our website and for the record. So before we begin, Mr. Trnka, if you allow us, some of the participants, if you'd like to please introduce yourselves. A few introductions have happened, but we would welcome some more.
I am Sachin Chaudhary from Indian Institute of Public Administration. I'm a faculty here.
You, Mr. Chaudhary?
Yeah, Sachin Chaudhary. I'm faculty at Institute of Public Administration.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. Let me give me a minute, please, to lay out the format of this talk, Mr. Trnka, and afterwards we leave the house open for questions, for discussions. While Mr. Trnka speaks, I request you to kindly switch off your microphones and park your questions for the end. You may type your questions, or you may please feel free to speak. What happens is that if you microphones, there's an echo, so it becomes difficult for the speaker to then keep track of one's own voice. Again, if some introductions are there, we are welcoming. I think some camera had switched on, and then I started speaking. So, would you like to introduce yourself, Mr. Garg? I think.
Yeah, good afternoon. I am Satpal Garg, member PNGR.
Welcome, sir. Most welcome. Nice to have you with us.
Thank you so much.
Without further ado, sir, over to you, Mr. Trnka. Over to you. We can have the presentation up, please.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much for the introduction. But most importantly, thank you very much for having me. Believe it or not, in my professional career in the OECD, I have worked with many countries and I visited many countries, but I've never had an opportunity to work with any authority or anybody in India. So it's really a great pleasure, at least virtually, to talk to you. And it's great to see so many of you connected to this webinar. So thank you very much for finding time and being with us and with me today. I will try during my presentation to walk you through the OECD view on what we call regulatory policy, what some countries call better regulation agenda or good regulation principles. But these are basically different names for the same thing, for caring about regulatory quality. And I will talk about how things work or don't work in some cases in the OECD countries. You might know that the OECD has been working in the field of regulatory policy since the 90s. So we have quite some experience in this field and on how our principles are applied by OECD member, but also non-member countries. So I'm talking not just from but also from the experience of my colleagues in the regulatory policy division in the OECD. Once again, pleasure to be here. Very nice to virtually meet so many of you. I'm trying to move the slides. Okay, it works now. So let me start with how do we define regulation in the OECD, because sometimes there's a little bit of misunderstanding. So the official definition of regulation, as the OECD sees regulation, says that regulation concerns how governments intervene in the economy in pursuit of social, economic, and environmental objectives through laws and other instruments. And I would like to put emphasis on the last two words, other instruments, because we don't want to talk just about laws and secondary legislation, bylaws, regulations, but we more and more try to talk about other non-regulatory instruments, such as information campaigns, for example, economic incentives, taxes, subsidies, etc. So we do not understand narrowly regulation as just legislative instrument, even though the biggest part, the biggest chunk of our work still deals with laws, draft laws, secondary legislation. But we talk about the ways how governments or administrations try to influence the behavior of citizens, businesses, public sector organizations, non-governmental organizations. And the important point there is trying to influence the behavior. And we will get back into this a little bit later. So again, we talk about different instruments. But from the very beginning, we have been always talking about ensuring regulatory quality, improving regulation. Good regulation is definitely needed in many cases to protect our health, to protect the safety of citizens, to protect the environment, the quality of environment, and also sometimes to enhance the functioning of markets, to create a level playing field. Deregulation is fine where free markets work better, but where they don't, it's important that states intervene and introduce regulation. What we focus on is the fact that this regulation is of high quality, and we are developing policies and documents and papers stressing the fact that if there is a need to introduce regulation, which might not always be the best solution, it is important to put emphasis on the quality of regulation. I've already said that we have been working in the field of what we call in the beginning regulatory reform, and then regulatory improvement and regulatory governance since the 90s. And these are just some of our most important documents, some most important recommendations or resolutions of the OECD Council. We started in 1995 with the first recommendation of the OECD Council on improving the quality of government regulation. Then we went through the years, but for the moment, probably the most important document for us is the recommendation of the Council of the OECD on regulatory policy and governance that was issued and approved by the OECD Council in 2012. And it's basically a relatively brief summary compendium of the experience of all OECD countries in the field of regulatory policy and governance. It's very ambitious. I would say that probably there's no country in the world that would be 100% in compliance with the recommendation. The recommendation is not binding, it's a soft law. But all countries agreed that they should strive in their efforts to achieve the standards set by this recommendation. Recommendation, like I said, is the most important high-level document for us, and you can see the cover in the upper corner of this slide, and it's available, of course, on our website, and you will see the address of our website at the end of my presentation. But it's not the only document, obviously, that we developed. We are trying to unbundle these recommendations and provide a little bit more practical guidance to our member states and also to non-member countries. And that's why in the OECD we're also issuing the so-called best practice principles. So the last set that was published only a few weeks ago was the OECD best practice principles on one-stop shops. Earlier this year, we published best practice principles on regulatory impact assessment. Before that, there were best practice principles on the governance of regulators, which might be really interesting for you, on regulatory enforcement and inspections. And in the very near future, during this summer, during the upcoming 2 months, we should publish also the best practice principles on reviewing the existing stock of regulations. Besides that, we do short analytical reports, but we also conduct so-called country reviews, meaning that we review the situation in the field of regulatory policy and governance in member or also non-member countries. We reviewed basically all of the OECD members, many of them twice. Some countries like Mexico, we have actually published more than 3 of these country reviews. Sometimes we focus on specific areas, such as administrative simplification, impact assessment. And we also publish every 4 years the so-called indicators of regulatory quality, where basically we use the 2012 recommendation as a basis, and we compare OECD countries vis-à-vis the fact how they are complying with the 2012 recommendations. And of course, the results are published on our website, but also in the Regulatory Policy Outlook, which is our flagship publication. But let's get back to the recommendation on regulatory policy and governance, and what is our view on regulatory quality. The recommendation, I would say for the first time, defined our approach to regulations, to the life cycle of regulations in the what we call a regulatory governance cycle. And you can see it on the slide I'm right now presenting. It's relatively easy. It's nothing very complicated. But what we are saying on this picture is basically that governments, administrations might decide that there is an issue for government action. And they should think about what they are trying to achieve, a policy roadmap, and choose the right policy instruments. In some cases, this will be non-regulatory instruments. In many other cases, it will be regulations. And that's when the 2012 recommendation kicks in, because then they should start caring about regulatory quality and ensuring regulatory quality. So when governments decide that they should either develop a new regulation, new piece of law or bylaw, or amend existing regulations, they should start really thinking about how to make sure that this new piece of legislation is of the highest possible quality. They go through the process of designing new regulations or amending the existing regulations, and then obviously they need to implement this regulation and enforce it. Then, in the ideal world, you should also monitor and evaluate the performance of the existing regulations. But let me say that this doesn't happen regularly in many of the OECD countries. But logically, it would be a logical step. If you have regulations that exist, you should look at them whether they work or not, whether they need to be adjusted, amended, etc. And if you find out that they maybe are not working as much as originally expected, then probably you have an issue for government action, and you should think about developing another instrument or adjusting the existing one. And then we go in a circle, in a round, and that's why it is important to look at regulations from all these different perspectives. But it's also important that during this whole process, you work on the basis of the 4 C's as we define them. So consultations with stakeholders, not just inside the government, but outside the government, are really crucial, are very important. It is important to coordinate with other bodies in the administration, not at the same level only. So if you're a federal country, you shouldn't work just with other ministries or other institutions at the central level, but you should also work with subnational governments, whether they are states, regions, municipalities, etc. You should cooperate with all actors that might be influenced or might play a role in any of these phases of the regulatory governance cycle. And of course, you should communicate clearly. It is very important that the goals, the purpose, the content of all regulations are clearly communicated to all stakeholders. I'm saying all this because really our thinking about regulatory quality is structured around this regulatory governance cycle, which might look relatively simple, but it has really some important elements for our work. The recommendation from 2012 defines different elements of regulatory policy and governance. And as you can see, there are many of them, and I will try to walk you through most of them during my presentation. So let me just say in the beginning, and we will get back to this slide at the end of my presentation, we divided those into 4 areas. The first one is strategic approach. Then we talk about institutions. Then we talk about regulatory management tools, and we will spend most of the presentation talking about those tools. And then we talk about governance, so how administrations, how governments approach regulatory policy. So let's start with the first column, and maybe with the policy, regulatory policy, or policy for regulatory quality. Let me just take a step back here, and normally, if this was a standard physical presentation where I would be present on the side, I would ask participants how many of them actually know what is regulatory policy. Because if you think about it, how many tools do governments have to actually pursue their goals, to work with citizens, businesses, public sector organizations? I mean, the first one is probably spending and taxes. And you hear many people talking about fiscal policy. Then, of course, it's the money, it's the stability of the currency, inflation, and you hear many people talking about monetary policy. But then, one of the most important instruments governments have are laws, bylaws, regulations. But you almost never hear anybody, any politician, talk about regulatory policy, even though it's probably among 3 most important policies of the government that should be in place. But not many governments actually have what is defined in the recommendation as an explicit, dynamic, and consistent whole of government policy. And I would like to put emphasis on the whole of government part. It's really important to have a policy in place that looks at regulatory quality, involves all the phases of the regulatory governance cycle, sets some principles of good regulation, sets some measurable objectives, and helps to communicate also to stakeholders about these goals and the objectives and the content of regulatory policy. Now, many of the OECD countries have some kind of regulatory policy, or they have a policy on administrative simplification, and they have a policy on impact assessment, but not really many of them have this whole of government policy that would cover everything, that would cover development of new regulations, their implementation and enforcement, their reviews, and also their delivery. It is also very important that there is a leader, that there is a minister, or even the prime minister, which is of course even better, that is leading regulatory policy. And again, in many countries, that's a part of an agenda of, let's say, the Ministry of Economy, one-line ministry. But then mostly it doesn't work because other ministries look at this as the agenda of the Ministry of Economy. We don't have to care about. But the regulatory quality is really cross-cutting. Regulatory quality is important across the administration, and that's why it's really important to have such policy that is explicitly defined by the government itself. Connected to regulatory policy is the institutional framework and important capacities for regulatory policy. Now, I have just one slide talking about the institutional framework, but I would say that probably this is one of the most crucial parts of having a functioning regulatory policy. It's really important that a body or several bodies, this is the case in many countries, coordinates regulatory policy again across the administration. What we're saying in the recommendation is that this coordinating body should be either part or very close to the center of government. So in the government office, prime minister's office, in the presidential office. Let me use an example of the United States, where there is an office that is called Office for Information and Regulatory Affairs that is part of the presidential administration, really close to the president, and it's nicknamed as the most important office nobody knows about. And that's because they have really important powers. They are really coordinating regulatory policy across the administration, but they are not that visible. There are many other institutions in the United States that are more visible than this body, but this body is really influencing the politics and the outcomes of the administrations more than many other institutions. Still, in many countries, such bodies do not exist. There is quite a high fragmentation. You have one body that cares about legal quality. There's another body that is overseeing the quality of impact assessments. There might be another institution that is coordinating administrative simplification projects. The landscape is quite diverse, I have to say. And we are trying to develop some kind of a comparative study right now of all the bodies that are involved in regulatory oversight. What became relatively popular right now, especially in Europe, but also in other countries, is developing so-called independent watchdogs. So let me give you one example. In the United Kingdom, for example, you have the Regulatory Policy Committee, which is not part of the administration. It is an advisory body to the government, to the cabinet. And you have different views represented there, so different parties, you have businesses represented there, you have trade unions represented there, NGOs, and they look at the quality of the analysis, which we will talk about in a minute, of the analysis that companies all draft legislation that is prepared by the administration, by the government, and submitted to the cabinet for discussion. They don't look at the content, they just look whether all the information are there, whether the cabinet will decide based on complete information. So these independent watchdogs exist in, I think, about 7 European countries, and also the European Commission has one. And they are, like I said, not part of the administration, but contribute to the oversight over quality of regulation. Parliaments should play an important role in ensuring regulatory quality. And I have to say that whenever I talk about regulatory policy, there is always somebody who says, well, look, it doesn't matter very much how much we care about regulatory quality here in the administration, in the government, in our ministry, because there is always the parliament, which is basically a black box. They can propose anything they want. They don't care about potential impacts. They only decide based on their political preferences, and they can amend even the drafts that are submitted by the government. So whatever happens in the parliament is a black box. And we are trying to promote the idea that parliaments should care about regulatory quality as much as the executive power. So should the judiciary. In some countries now courts can actually review legislation based on the principles of regulatory quality, but again, it's just the beginning. And then in our work, we deal a lot with, and it might be interesting for all of you, regulatory agencies, the so-called regulators. We have established a network of economic regulators, so representatives of water regulators, energy, telecom, financial regulators, many other, are meeting in Paris twice a year to discuss various aspects of the governance and statute of regulatory agencies. I believe that my colleague Anna Pietikainen will also have a presentation to all of you, so I'm not going to spend too much time on this. If you have any questions, then we can maybe deal with them bilaterally. But there is a whole stream of work where we focus purely on regulatory agencies, which are a very important part of the institutional setup for regulatory quality. Now let's focus a little bit on regulatory management tools, and let's start with developing new regulations. In our view, the process of developing new regulation, the regulation making process should be, first of all, based on evidence. And all regulators, all ministries, all civil servants, basically, that are involved in developing new regulations should ask themselves the question if a regulation is really the best available means to address the policy objective. It should always be based on thinking about different options. Now, the instinct of many civil servants when they are dealing with the problem is, yes, we need to draft a law that will deal with the issue. But are there any other options? Are there any alternatives? Can you maybe enforce the existing regulations a little bit better? Can you just adjust them? Can you explain them better so regulated subjects actually understand the purpose and make it easier for them to comply? Or are there any non-regulatory alternatives? You should ask yourselves all these questions when developing new regulations. And then obviously you should think about what will be the cost, because there are always costs attached to any regulation. For certain groups, sometimes for businesses, sometimes for consumers, sometimes for other specific sectors of the economy. But you should always think about these costs, because regulations are not for free. Many countries think only about costs for the budget, for public budgets. How much does it cost for the government? But they should really think about how much will it cost for businesses, for citizens, for society as such. And the process should be really open and transparent. So regulations should be developed in cooperation with stakeholders. It should be completely transparent, so there is no undue lobbying and influencing from some specific interests. And basically, this all can be, to a certain degree, ensured if you're using what we call RIA, or Regulatory Impact Assessment. And on this slide, you see the process of regulatory impact assessment. And it might look a little bit complicated if you look at it for the first time, but basically it's a decision-making process we are all using in our everyday lives when we're deciding what are we going to do, what are we going to eat for lunch, what are we going to buy, for example. This is a standard decision-making process. And at the very beginning of this decision-making process, there's always a definition phase. You need to define a problem that you are trying to solve, and you should set the objectives. What are you trying to achieve? Now, this sounds simple, but let me say that this is probably the most complicated part of the regulation making process in most of the OECD and even non-OECD countries. Why? Because the primary instinct of all politicians is to come up with some activities, show that they are doing something, so that drafting laws is one of the most visible indicators of activity of politicians, political parties, etc. But in many cases, civil servants are not able to define the problem they should deal with. And I've seen it many times in my career as one of the members of the oversight body, or before when I was working in the administration in the Czech Republic. Usually, when you ask for a definition of the problem or the objective, you get something like we are drafting the law, so there is a law that would regulate this and that, this and that. But drafting a law cannot be an objective. You really need to set an objective of which is measurable, which is smart, that's specific, etc. So you should say, what are you trying to achieve? You are, for example, trying to reduce the number of cases of certain disease by, let's say, 20%, and it should be time bound. So you're saying you're trying to achieve this by 2025 or 2030. Why this is important? Because without setting these objectives, you will never be able to find out whether the regulation is working or not. So it makes it impossible, if you don't define these objectives, it makes it impossible to evaluate these regulations later. We'll get back to that. But like I said, in many countries, defining a problem and setting the objectives is the cornerstone of our regulations that simply doesn't work. Then, as I've mentioned before, you should identify all potential options. So you should think about what can be done, whether there should be really new law, whether you should amend an existing law, whether you should maybe improve compliance or inspections, whether you should improve enforcement, or whether you should maybe inform your stakeholders better. And there's always one option you should always think of, and that's the do nothing option, zero option. So doing nothing. Actually, it might be in many cases the best solution. You never know. You should always take this possibility into account. And then you should evaluate costs, benefits, and other impacts of all these different alternatives, all these different options. So you should think about direct costs, but also indirect costs. And I believe last week you had a great presentation from my former colleague, Mr. Eric Thompson, who presented the cost-benefit analysis of regulation. So I don't have to go into too much detail, but basically you need to follow this process for when drafting regulations. And then based on that, you select the best alternative, the best option, and you finish the process with designing the regulation. And when designing the regulation, you should always think about how this regulation will be enforced, how you make sure that actually those that will be regulated will comply with the regulation, and how you will monitor and evaluate that the regulation is working, or to what extent it is working. And then only after that, there is the decision-making process. And I'm saying that because in many cases, there's an argument against RIA, which is saying, well, politicians were elected to make decisions. So why replacing this political decision-making process by something at the level of the administration? We are not trying to replace political decision-making. We are just trying through this process to give those that were elected to make decisions the best available data, the best available information, the best available analysis. So going through the regulatory impact assessment process should actually help politicians, elected representatives, to make better decisions that are based on facts, based on evidence. This is the regulation making process. It sounds relatively easy, but there are many challenges in implementing regulatory impact assessment. Basically now, most of the OECD countries have some policy on RIA, have some obligation to conduct impact assessment, but usually they do it very late in the process. So the decision has been already made, and then they're trying to do the analysis that would actually justify the decision that has been already made. But that goes against the goal of regulatory impact assessment. It should guide you through the process and help you to make better decisions. But still, in many countries, this is the case. There is also a problem of proportionality, meaning that many countries are trying to conduct full RIA, full cost-benefit analysis for all regulations, but because they don't have the data, it's impossible. Cost-benefit analysis is quite resource-intense, so they don't have. It takes time, it takes people, it takes capacities, and they are not able basically to comply with this obligation. it's always a problem to find the data. But we're living in the world where basically there is a lot of data out there. When you look out of the window, you can't see them, obviously, but in the digital environment, there is an incredible amount of data. And more, it's not a problem of having those data. It's more a problem of being able to find those data and process them. I mean, it happened to me in my previous career in the ministry that one ministry was trying to regulate a certain economic activity. They didn't have any idea how many businesses actually operated in the market. So my answer to that was, how can you regulate the market if you have no idea how many regulated subjects you actually have on the market? You need to at least make an effort to find those data, to process those data, to work on the basis of estimates sometimes. And sometimes it's really difficult to monetize the costs and benefits. And now with the COVID crisis, it was actually impossible to predict all the effects of very quickly adopted measures and adopted regulations. But it's really important at least to think about them. I mean, I'm always saying that RIA is not about precise calculations. It's not about the numbers. It's always about the process, going through the process, thinking about different options, and try to choose the right options. If the impacts will be 10 billion or 15 billion, it's important, but you will never be able to find the exact data, but it's at least important to think about them. Also, there are some issues with consultations. Requirements to consult on RIA are widespread, but in many cases, ministries just publish RIA at the very end of the process, and then they go their own way anyway. And then there is a huge issue of regulatory oversight. And there are studies that prove that if there is one thing that is really crucial when implementing regulatory impact assessment in a country, then it's having a properly functioning regulatory oversight body. So you need to have the challenging function in the administration, somebody who will look at the quality of the analysis that is independent from the ministry or a body that is drafting the regulation. They will look at the quality of the analysis and say, well, you didn't think about this option. You didn't think about these costs or these benefits, or you didn't consult with these and these stakeholder groups. So you should get back to your desk and do better, because the government deserves better background information, background analysis. So in many countries, they are still struggling with implementing regulatory impact assessment. And I would say that since I remember, the situation has got much better. One important aspect of not just developing new laws, but also implementing them and reviewing them is stakeholder engagement. Obviously, when we live in a democratic system, stakeholders have a full right to participate in the regulation making process. And they should be informed about what's going on, and they should have the right to have their say, to make their voices heard, and to influence the regulation making process. So that's one aspect, how to look at stakeholder engagement. But also, it's very useful actually to engage with stakeholders from the very start of the legislation making process. Because, believe it or not, us bureaucrats, us civil servants, usually don't have all the necessary information. We usually don't know exactly what happens in real life when we introduce regulations. And stakeholders are the ones who have this information, who can provide us with this information. And they might even propose different solutions we didn't think of. Like I said, the primary instinct of many civil servants is to come up with new laws. But maybe stakeholders see it differently, and maybe they will think about ideas that will solve the problem without introducing new regulations. I mean, it might be self-regulations of the industry, or there might be information campaigns, which I have mentioned several times. And most importantly, if you talk to your stakeholders about regulations that are either reviewed or being developed, it really increases a sense of ownership among stakeholders, and they are more likely to comply with these regulations. Now, for example, in Denmark, they had the so-called Business Regulation Forum. And the ministry meets with representatives of businesses, including small and medium enterprises, and they discuss with them the problems connected with regulation. And sometimes they manage to solve the issue, sometimes they don't, but at least they listen to their stakeholders and at least they try to explain why it is not possible to solve the problem, solve the issue. And let me say that the rate of compliance in Denmark is much higher, and also the level of satisfaction among businesses is much higher in Scandinavian countries or Baltic countries, where they have a tradition of talking to stakeholders than in the rest of the OECD. We like to talk about three different levels of stakeholder engagement. The most simple of them is information, so providing information on what kind of regulations exist, what is their purpose. This is relatively easy. Then there is a two-way process, public consultation. So the government publishes something on their website and then receives comments from the side of stakeholders. And the highest level is participation, so really working with stakeholders, involving them in the process of drafting new laws. Again, one example from Denmark, they have this Burden Hunters project. They actually send civil servants out of their offices to spend a shift with a truck driver or in a farm to really see what kind of impacts their regulations have in real life. And then they invite truck drivers, farmers, businesses back to their offices, and together they are trying to find some solutions. That's the sort of highest level of stakeholder engagement. It's really important to start working with stakeholders early in the process, as I said before. Why? Because again, I remember from my career as a civil servant, we had the obligation to consult with the public, but at the end of the process, so you spend several months working on a legislative draft. Then after these 6 months, let's say you put it on the internet, you certainly hope that you will not receive any comments. And your willingness to change the law, which you have worked on for 6 months, is relatively limited. So it's better to start very early because you can hear about different options, you can different views, and maybe you will be able to adjust the draft in the process. Then let's move to reviewing existing regulations. Why this is important, right? This is important especially because all regulations are basically experiments. When we are developing new regulations, we don't know what will happen. And some of the regulations, let's be honest, will not work. Others will work for some time, but will have passed their use. Regulatory framework is dynamic, and the regulatory field is changing over time. And we should always think about whether regulations are delivering, whether they are performing well. We should look at their performance continuously. Also, it's important to focus on the stock of regulation because it's much greater than the flow. So there are many more opportunities in reviewing the existing stock of regulations than when focusing only on just new regulations. And obviously, they can also, exposed reviews can also provide learning for the future. So you get a lot of information, you get a lot of data that are really important for developing new regulations and the future. And then I've already mentioned that if you involve stakeholders in the process of evaluations, you build trust, you build the atmosphere of mutual confidence, and therefore it's much more likely that you will get some kind of political support from your stakeholders. There are many ways how to review existing regulations. Now, actually, that was the Australian Productivity Commission that divided these approaches to regulatory reviews into three major areas. First, one of them that is more ongoing are stock management reviews. Some kind of stock flow rules, for example. In a lot of OECD countries, what now became popular are the so-called 1 in, 1 out, 1 in, 2 out, or even 1 in, 3 out approaches, or regulatory offsetting, as we call it. What does that mean? Well, in a simplified way, that basically means that for every new regulation, that there must be another regulation that is withdrawn from the books. So whenever a ministry, a regulator, a government wants to introduce a new regulation, they have to withdraw an existing regulation from the book. This is the simplest form. The more I would say, sophisticated, if I can use this word in connection with one in X out, is using really regulatory offsetting. So you're offsetting costs. So for every new regulation, excuse me, for every new regulation that will cost additional dollar of regulatory costs, you need to reduce these regulatory costs elsewhere. So you don't need to repeal a regulation, but you need to amend some regulations that you actually reduce regulatory costs. I think this principle was first introduced in the UK. It was so successful that from one in, one out, so £1 of new cost for £1 reduction of regulatory costs, they moved to 1 in, 2 out. So for one new pound, you had to reduce twice as much. They moved even from to 1 in, 3 out. Now, relatively recently, this measure was introduced in the United States. It works in Canada, in Germany. There are limitations when it comes to regulatory offsetting, that's for sure. But it's a good communication tool, and it helps to put pressure on regulators and ministries to think about the costs of regulations. Then there are program mechanisms, so sunsetting existing rules. Basically, they need to be reviewed after a certain period of time. Otherwise, they will cease to exist. They will not be enforced anymore. This became more popular now with the COVID-19 crisis because the new temporary measures are actually introduced with some sunsetting measures. So they are introduced only for 1 year, and then they need to be reviewed and either extended, or for 3 months, for example. They are either reviewed and extended, or they will not be enforced anymore. In some countries, they have an obligation of post-implementation review. So after a certain period of time, when a new legislation or regulation is introduced, after 3 years, it needs to be reviewed to find out whether it's working or not. And the last group are special purpose reviews, ad hoc reviews. And I would use an example of red tape reduction project, administrative burden reduction project. So 15 years ago, especially in Europe, it was very popular to measure administrative burdens and to reduce them, and governments set themselves a goal of 25% reduction in 5 years. It was very popular at the time. Basically all European countries set some kind of 25% reduction goal. Some countries actually managed to achieve this goal, but businesses were still not happy about the level of reduction. They either didn't see the effects, or in some countries it led to sort of cutting that cost, so repealing regulations that didn't have any effect anyway because they were outdated, not enforced. In some countries they became really obsessed with numbers. So in Denmark, they managed to reduce administrative burdens by 23% in the first year. And then they spent the remaining 4 years looking for the remaining 2%. And they didn't manage to achieve it, actually. So these projects are still a good way to start regulatory policy, but they are not as effective and efficient as they might have been. And if you still remember the regulatory governance cycle, that was one phase we didn't talk about, and that is about implementing regulations, ensuring compliance, enforcement, and inspections. Because regulations that are not being enforced, they can never work. They can never achieve their goals. So it's really important to think about whether these regulations are actually complied with by regulated subjects and how they are enforced. And in many more countries, there are two different pressures on regulators and inspection authorities. They're asked to do more and better, to protect us better, to protect better the health and safety and the environment. At the same time, their financial resources and human resources are being reduced. So they are basically asked to do more with less resources. So they have to think about how to make their activities more effective and efficient, how to target them better. And if you think about it, probably doesn't make any sense to inspect one small cafe on the corner here 3 times a month. And it's probably better to focus on businesses with a higher level of risk, on areas with a higher level of risk. It's probably not a good idea to inspect a business that has a record of complying with all regulations for the last 10 years so often as someone who has been cheating all the time, who has been cheating with taxes, with occupational health and safety. So it's better to really focus on the areas and on businesses that can present higher risk. And we issued best practice principles on that. It's important to make really enforcement more evidence-based, to measure compliance, to really analyze how and why maybe regulated subjects do not comply with the existing regulations. And it's really essential to focus on supporting compliance. So inspections and enforcement, it's not just about finding violations and punishing businesses. It's really about helping them to comply. Because the interest of the government should be that those businesses actually stay in the market, and they sometimes offer jobs, they contribute to cross-domestic product, they are delivering some benefit to the society. So the goal should be to keep them on the market unless they are really violating too many rules, but to help them to comply, to inform them better about what their obligations are, because in some cases it's impossible to find out. Maybe to provide information in their local, in their own native language, because they don't understand local language enough, which is the case of Chinese restaurants in London. They get flyers with a summary of applicable regulations in Mandarin, so they can understand. So when inspecting and finding minor violations, it's much better to give them some time to improve the situation and to give them advice on how to improve than to impose a fine or even ban their operation. So this is a very important area, and again, not many countries really focus on that. Not many countries have a policy. Probably last thing I wanted to mention, because I'm running out of time, is the importance of international regulatory cooperation that has become more and more important during the last 10, 20 years. And I understand that the slide is a little bit difficult to read, but it's a list basically of different mechanisms, international regulatory mechanisms that are available to countries. From unilateral actions. What do we mean by that? Well, when you're developing regulations, you should think already about international trade and how these regulations might influence international trade. So when analyzing impacts as part of the RIA process we talked about, you should always think about impacts it will have on international trade and on foreign companies, for example, foreign investments. Then you have a list of bilateral measures that you can use. So trade agreements with other countries. And then, of course, you have multilateral. So one of the examples this country, France, is a member of is the European Union, but there might be other multilateral trade agreements. Unfortunately, it seems that in this period we are moving a little bit away from international regulatory cooperation, and some of the major players are actually doing everything to stop this kind of cooperation. We hope this is only temporary, because it's really important. As we say in our most recent report, no regulator is an island. And especially in light of the COVID-19 crisis, it became so obvious that countries need to cooperate in responding to the crisis and even making economies more resilient. It's really important that countries cooperate with each other across frontiers, across boundaries. It is important to think about international regulatory cooperation, because there are many costs that are connected with regulatory heterogeneity. So if you have different regulations that are applied in two neighboring countries, it makes international trade between those two countries really difficult, because there's a lot of just costs connecting with finding out what is applicable in the neighboring country. Then you have to maybe produce two different products with two different specifications. If you need a conformity assessment certificate, again, you need to pay twice in two different countries. There's a lot of costs that are connected if a country or countries do not care enough about regulatory cooperation. So coming back to the list, I believe we managed to go through all these elements except one, which is national and subnational interaction. And this is The reason why I didn't talk about it very much is that we don't have so much information. We actually want to focus on this aspect of regulatory policy and governance in the future. We are working on projects in Mexico, when we work not just with the federal government, but also with the states and even municipalities to extract some good practice examples from there. But we still don't have anything published on this topic that would be presentable that I could present here. But I understand it would be an important topic in India, obviously. This is my last slide. I see that my time is up, so I would like to thank you very much for your attention. One last thing I would like to mention is that the OECD is very happy to support all our members, but also non-member countries. We work with many countries on bilateral projects. We conduct reviews, but we also provide technical assistance. So I'm saying that because we, at least our division, for the moment and in the last 10 years, did not have any projects with any Indian authorities or with the Indian government. And it would be definitely very interesting for the organization itself, but also for our division to get in touch with some of you to think about potential projects. So if you are interested in exploring the ways how we could cooperate together, do not hesitate to contact me. You have my email address, you have the address of our website, even my Twitter handle. So if you are interested, please do get in touch with me or any of my colleagues, and we would be happy to discuss these options with you. Once again, thank you very much for your participation. Thank you very much for your patience, and I would be happy to answer any questions you might have now.
Thank you so much. I think this was a very, very insightful session. And now for the participants to have who have any questions or observations or any thoughts that you'd like to share, please feel free. You can switch on your microphones and speak to us, please. Yes, Mr. Negi. Welcome, sir. Sir, you're not audible. So I'm afraid we can't hear you. So would you like to type your question in the type box, in the chat box? Or you could try reconnect. Any other question till then, till Mr. Negi tries reconnecting? I think there is a network issue. Yes, Aruni Sharma ji, please go ahead.
First of all, I would like to thank Mr. Daniel for such a wonderful presentation. And sir, my question to you is regarding performance evaluation. Could you please throw a light on the importance of performance evaluation in regulatory governance?
Thank you very much for your kind words, and thank you for this question. It's absolutely crucial, I would say. And as I mentioned during my presentation, it's really important to look at the existing stock of regulations, to look whether these regulations are performing well. So in other words, whether they are achieving their objectives. For this, what is really crucial is that these objectives are actually set, so we know what these regulations are trying to achieve. Now, it is a problem in many countries because, like I said, the indicator of activity of governments and administrations is actually, in many cases, a number of new regulations being developed. It's never the number of of existing regulations that are reviewed. So many governments don't actually like to look at the existing regulations. because sometimes they might find out that what they adopted with a big bang a few years ago actually doesn't work. So that's why many governments are not promoting the use of evaluation in government. The techniques that can be used are very similar to the techniques that can be used in the process of developing new regulations. So in a way, impact assessment. You need a counterfactual, so how the situation would look like without the existing regulation. It's sometimes difficult to evaluate, to assess, but at least you should try. You can use cost-benefit analysis. You should again look at the different costs and benefits that the regulation is bringing to various stakeholders, groups of stakeholders, sectors of the economy, both direct, indirect costs and benefits. Just yesterday, actually, a publication of the OECD on policy evaluation was issued, and there was a launch. So if you are interested, again, it's on the OECD website, or send me an email. I would be happy to send you the publication. It compares basically the situation in OECD countries and sets some good practice principles. I could talk about it for hours. I don't think we have that much time, but let me just conclude with the fact that evaluation is crucial, but it's sort of an unwanted child in many administrations.
Thank you, sir. Can we have more questions, if there are any more questions? Yes, Ritu?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Daniel. Adding on to Aruni's question, is there any particular country, in your opinion, you feel is following the performance evaluation mechanism properly? Any country which you would like to refer to?
Oh, thank you. I think my first choice would be Australia. Australia is really a leading country when it comes to evaluation of the existing regulations, and they're also leading our indicators. We have 3 different components. One of them is ex-post evaluation, and Australia is in the lead. There are successful attempts in other countries when it comes to administrative burden reductions. Some European countries are pretty good, Germany, the Netherlands, but Australia is probably the champion.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Needs to be answered. I was wondering, sir, your thoughts on the non-quantifiable effects of regulation. Not everything can be objectified and quantified. So, what are your thoughts on that, sir?
That is true, and there is an argument against using quantitative techniques in both developing and reviewing the existing regulations. But there are 2 answers to that. Excuse me. One of them is sometimes we're surprised how many effects are actually quantifiable. And I think Eric Thompson last week presented a lot of methods how various effects of regulations can be actually quantified using the link to pay techniques, etc. If they are really not quantifiable, or if it might not be seen as ethical to quantify these effects, for example, if we are saving lives, in some countries they have a statistical value of life, but it might be a little bit, not ethical to put a money on the life of a person. Then these effects should be at least described qualitatively. So it's really important that we have all these effects into account. If we have to decide that saving 5 lives would cost us, I don't know, 2 million euros or 20 million euros, it's up to the government to decide whether it's worth it. But they should have the information. So it's important to take these effects into account as well.
Thank you, sir. We are very honored to have with us Dr. Mukulita Vijayvargiya. I can see ma'am. And ma'am, over to you. Ma'am is a member at IBBI.
Dr. Mr. Daniel, just one very crucial question. Being a member of the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Board of India, I want to tell you that we have a very unique organization Insolvency and Bankruptcy Board of India, Section 196 of the code confers power on the board to lay down regulations for the processes as well as to regulate the professionals. You will find that we have many enactments where only the enactment regulates only the professions, like the Advocates Act or the Medical Council Act, some regulating doctors. But this code confers power on the board to regulate the process as well as the professionals. So whether this combination is a healthy practice as per the regulatory policy or not.
I'm sorry, I'm not sure if I understood the question. Maybe if you can repeat, there was an echo.
The Insolvency and Bankruptcy Board of India has been conferred the power to lay down regulations or to make regulations for the processes relating to insolvency resolution.
Mhm.
Again, it has been conferred with the power to regulate the professionals, insolvency professionals also. While we find that in other cases, for example, Advocates Act is there, which regulates only the lawyers, not the processes. So two functions have been combined under this code. Rather, the regulator regulating both the things, is it a healthy practice or it violates some kind of check and balances?
Okay, I don't think this is a common practice, and what we're saying is that there should be sort of a Chinese wall or some division between enforcing regulations and making them work and issuing regulations. I don't know what are the specificities of your system. Obviously, I would need to look at it in more detail together with my colleagues. But my first answer would be it's not standard. There should be, if it's part of one body, at least inside the body, there should be some kind of a Chinese wall there. But it's not normal. It should be the regulators, the institutions should be responsible for implementing regulations and enforcing them. It should be the government that issues regulations, actually regulating the processes as you described.
Now, when this is a situation, then how to measure the performance? You have said that in your, I think in your one of the slides, it is you have mentioned that you have mentioned about the level of compliance measured and analyzed. So when both the functions are combined together, in what way we need to measure?
Well, I think what you need to measure and look at are actually the effects for the society. So are there how many businesses are there function in different sectors of the economy? How of them go through the process of insolvency, and how long are these processes? So more on the outcomes. In this case, and again, I'm not able to answer in detail without analyzing the situation, but in this case, I would even suggest that some other institution actually looks at the performance of the regulatory framework as such, not particular regulations. And that is one thing I forgot to say. It's really important to look at the whole framework, how it works, including the institutional setup, for example. So you would look on the effects on the economy. How many jobs are actually created, or how many jobs are lost because of insufficiently defined processes and insufficiently developed regulations.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir, and thank you, ma'am, for your very valid question. This is actually a unique situation to be in, and I think Mr. Daniel is forced to think in a different direction. He hasn't heard of such a setup. Thank you, ma'am. Any other question? Maybe we can take a last question, or maybe a couple of questions. I know we are exceeding the time, but we are tempted to, sir, bombard you with our questions if there are any more. No, I think that is the end of it. Sir, thank you so much for taking out time out of your very, very busy schedule being with us today on behalf of the Indian Corporate Affairs, on behalf of the School of Competition Law and FOIA, that is the Forum of Indian Regulators. I would like to extend my thanks to you for being with us, for your excellent presentation. Your slides were extremely useful, and the way you explained them. You are a repository of knowledge on regulatory affairs, and we hope to continue this association with you. This is only a starting point, sir, and I hope that we at the School of Competition Law get an opportunity to work with you in future. With this, I'd like to thank all the participants for making this session as healthy as it was today. And thank you all for being with us. This international webinar series is turning out to be quite a success, thanks to our esteemed speakers. And again, sir, thank you so much for being with us today. Have a good day, sir.
Thank you very much. It was a great pleasure, and I really hope to continue. Thank you.
Yes,
Have a
sir.
nice day.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you to all the participants.